Welcome to the Portland Real Estate Podcast, Oregon and Southwest Washington's #1 show for real estate news and information. Without further ado, here are your hosts and a couple of guys who, as busy realtors and successful brokerage owners, know a thing or two about real estate. Steve Nassar of Premier Property Group and Joe Fustolo of Soldera Properties.
This is officially episode number 153, and we got a great podcast today. What's great about it is we have these topics once in a while in our field where, just only enough to be dangerous. But then there's things that change so quickly that it's just easier to say, you know what, I don't know. You talk to this guy, he's an expert. And what we have today on our show is the ever-changing land use changes affecting Oregon real estate. And to introduce our two guests, let me introduce my co-host, Steve Nassar.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the introduction. Hey, I'm excited to have on here with us Jamie Howsley and Ezra Hammer from the prestigious law firm Jordan Ramis, PC. And Ezra is not a stranger to the podcast. He has been on here before. It was way back in the day. It was just me and Tucker, and we had Ezra on. He was working at the Home Builders Association. What was your position there again, Ezra? I think it's in our intro piece that we sent out to everybody. You were government affairs, right? Legal?
Yeah, I was government affairs director and then VP. Had the pleasure of working with the home builders on a bunch of fun stuff. Yeah.
Ezra comes with quite a pedigree. He's a licensed attorney. He's been on the legal side. He's worked with some home builders. He did some land acquisition with a large builder. He was in a VP role as well. Actually, I run about for 6 months now. I started a mastermind with a couple local builders that I work with. Riverside Homes is one of them. Craig Shuck is in the mastermind. And then Boylan Homes is a good friend of mine. Eli Boylan, we grew up together. He's a really strong builder in the Salem market. And Ezra has also been a pivotal part of that mastermind with us since the very beginning. And just recently, not even a month ago, as a guest, we had Randy Sebastian from Renaissance Homes. Most of our listeners are very familiar with him. He met up with us and spent a couple hours as a guest. It was a really, really insightful and fun, lively mastermind that we had, just kind of talking all things building and development and the gotchas and the opportunities and all that fun stuff. Well, in that process, a couple things. First of all, I learned that you guys, you two, Jamie and Ezra now, are legal counsel for both those entities, which are very strong, big, reputable companies, Renaissance Homes and Riverside Homes. And so through that process, Ezra and I came up with this idea. Let's get you guys on the podcast. Let's have you bring some tremendous value to our listeners and talk about what's going on in Oregon and land use and development and laws and legal and all that fun stuff. So let me just let you guys, with no further introduction, take it away. Tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you're going to share with us today and our listeners.
Sure. Well, thanks again, Steve and Joe, for having us on. And again, I'm here joined by our team lead and partner here at Jordan Ramis, Jamie Howsley. Jamie has about three and a half decades, working on 3 decades, give or take, of experience in land use. And we've been getting into some really, really exciting stuff. It's a wild time for land use. In Oregon, the governor is getting highly involved and highly engaged, and that's having some fantastic trickle-down effects at the local levels. At the same time, we're continuing to see tension between the need for constructing housing and existing neighbors who are concerned about construction happening nearby them. And so those tensions are playing out at the hyperlocal level and greatly impact the realtor community insofar as these homes need to either get built so you can sell them or they're not getting built at all. So that's why we're so excited to join you today.
Awesome. Well, in the agenda that we set out, we said that we're going to start by talking about Washington County, a ban on new housing in Washington County. That sounds scary. What the heck is that about?
So this resulted from some litigation several years ago regarding trees out in Washington County, and an environmental outfit decided that one development project in particular wasn't doing enough to preserve the trees within the project. And so they took an appeal up to LUBA, which then thus resulted in an enforcement order against Washington County, which required Washington County to update their significant natural resources ordinance effectively to try to protect significant trees that would be in future development projects. The LCDC issued this enforcement order a couple years ago, and it's been basically resuscitated again as of this spring. And as a result of that, Washington County said, well, we're just going to hold all development applications through a moratorium until we can work our way through that process. So it's a pretty harsh result for something that should be a pretty simple fix.
Is this officially happening? And if so, when and for how long?
It's officially happened. I think for the moratorium will, I think, be there for the foreseeable future while they work through the process. Hopefully they can get through this within a year and turn back allow development applications to once again start to proceed forward. But it's really unfortunate that we're here in the middle of a housing crisis and we need to put more units on the ground, and yet we can't do that in a place where people really would like to live in Washington County.
Wow. I mean, that sounds massive, because Riverside, that's like the vast majority of where their development is done is Washington County. They really focus there. So you're saying no new permits will be, or no new development, land use or engineering applications will be taken? What segment of it is it particularly?
Yeah, basically no new development applications. And I should just be very cautious here. I'm not talking about the city of Beaverton, the city of Hillsborough. Those are different jurisdictions. This would just be unincorporated urban Washington County.
Gotcha. Okay. That is good clarification. Okay.
There's no exception for just bare farmland with no trees on it. That's just no exceptions whatsoever.
Yeah, that's kind of what's particularly galling, Joe, is that the county has some outdated mapping as it relates to where significant natural resources are. And essentially the state was saying not only is your mapping outdated, but the process with which you use to approve developments in those areas may not be up to par. And so we're just going to put the kibosh on all new housing generally.
Gotcha. What percentage, I know you're not going to be exact here, but roughly, if we look at Washington County, what percentage doesn't fall within like a Beaverton or Hillsborough or Sherwood and is in the unincorporated? Is that 10%, 20%, more or less?
So the area that we're talking about that's directly impacted is several hundred acres, but these are acres that otherwise could be primed for residential development. So we're not talking anything outside of the urban area. And as Jamie said, nothing that is in an incorporated jurisdiction, but there are these pockets in Washington County, such as Aloha, such as north of the freeway, that are seeing tremendous residential growth. And those are potentially some of the areas impacted.
Mm-hmm. Does this include areas that are unincorporated Washington County but could be annexed into a city?
Potentially, depending on what the city's potential growth pattern is. Yeah.
So this moratorium, or whatever you want to call it, would not allow it to get annexed into the city during that time period. And so it would just have to sit idly waiting for this to end.
I think if the city was willing to annex the property and take it out of Washington County's jurisdictional hands, then it would become under the purview or jurisdiction of that city. And, that would be one way to get around the moratorium. I think that the difficulty is a lot of these areas aren't really ready to be annexed to any cities there. So we're really talking about, like I said, several hundred acres that are sort of an island within this other cities around.
So it's safe to say that, because development takes a while, right? If they're not doing stuff in these areas for the next year, we're not going to feel it in the next year per se, but what we'll feel it is probably 3 years from now, right? There'll suddenly be this window where there's just not a lot of unincorporated Washington County development bringing on new housing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very accurate statement. And the way I would, if your listeners or you guys can remember back in 2008, when the Great Recession happened and the development pipeline sort of shut off, it doesn't turn immediately back on when the need sort of arises. And so in 2012, when you wanted to start, people were out actually trying to buy houses again, we weren't seeing new development projects hit the ground until 2015, 2016, just because of the lead time it takes to get through the process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I often think of it as like a train starting from a dead stop, right? It just takes a while for that machine to just start churning, right? And getting some speed, and building and development is very similar to that. And the opposite of that is true, right? In 2007, when the writing was on the wall that something bad was about to happen in real estate, it's not like everybody stopped building or slowed down their building. They had all these projects going. They had to kind of, the train was going 80 miles an hour, couldn't stop immediately or slow down immediately, right?
Curious about something. Anytime there's like government that we're force fed with kind of new regulations, I always like to know what's behind the curtain. So I'm not asking you for fact at the moment. I'm asking you maybe for your opinion. I understand saving the trees is very important, but usually there's something more behind it. And usually that's money. Or is the county are they trying to get these unincorporated people to annex? Or what do you suspect the real reason for this sort of ban on new construction in Washington County?
I just suspect that it's really costly to go do the analysis that is going to be required at Washington County. And, I think a lot of jurisdictions sort of struggle with where to prioritize their tax dollars. And unfortunately, this is sort of a low desired thing. It may ramp up in terms of importance based upon the housing needs of Washington County. But for the time being, I think this has just sort of gotten a low-level priority, and now we're sort of in a must-act situation.
And why do you think Washington County dropped the ball so much? I mean, of all the counties in the state, you'd think they're a little bit more with it. I mean, than say a rural or, something that's. Is there any guesses why they're so far behind on these surveys of trees versus other counties?
I think there's two things to consider here, Steve. One is because it's Washington County and so important, you have a lot of eyeballs on it. You have a lot of people that care about things that they might otherwise not be as focused on in a more rural setting. And you've seen a ton of growth in these areas. So you have neighbors who are mad about that growth and are starting to think creatively about how to stop it. You also have an interesting interplay here, which is the rule that the state actually utilized to put the ban on construction is a state law that was recently implemented and is starting to get used statewide, but is actually intended to promote the development of housing. And so this is a law that came about the conversation started in 2015. The law was actually implemented in 2017, but it was the intention of the legislature to make it clear to local jurisdictions that the rules that they put in place couldn't have a bunch of that wishy-washy stuff in them that often frustrates development and confuses people. But local jurisdictions, to Jamie's point, just haven't had the resources or the focus necessarily to go back to their existing codes and make the changes that would be necessary to implement state law. So you have this weird convergence of the legislature saying, hey, we need to make things more clear for builders and the development community, and local jurisdictions not having the time or money or focus necessarily to go make those changes. And what anti-growth activists were able to identify here in this situation is essentially that disconnect. And they pointed to that disconnect, and the state said, hey, yeah, your rules aren't good enough. Therefore, we're going to put this ban in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And who would you say are the biggest losers? I mean, landowners obviously are first and foremost, which is average Joes. And then do you think there's some builder developers that are sitting on land that they're just going to have to pay interest on for a year, and that's just going to come up in the price of the houses when they come online, right? I mean, it has to.
Yeah, ultimately, it's the consumer that loses here, because you're going to have additional holding costs for the land here, and that will often get reflected back in the price of the house or the price of the lot. It goes time to sell those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that can change this in your opinions, or is this just, it is what it is and it's going to take a year? And
well, I mean, I think they have to go through the analysis and get through that process. So I think it's, fortunately, we're sort of stuck with what it is for the moment.
Especially for your listeners that are interested in Washington County and may have property out there, certainly applying pressure to the elected officials in Washington County to make sure that they do this analysis quickly, that they do a good job with it so that it can withstand further scrutiny is absolutely important. As we discussed, these sorts of, analyses around natural resources just don't raise to the level of concern for a lot of elected officials. And so they don't prioritize this research. But if they start hearing from constituents that, hey, this ban is impacting us, this is very negative to my livelihood, then that'll help light a fire to make sure that this analysis gets done quickly and well.
And that's Washington County. So you're advising our listeners, if they wanted to try to affect change, the powers that be at Washington County itself, like, is that commissioners, county commissioners?
Yeah, Ezra?
Yes.
Okay. Would be the ones to reach out to. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Let's move on to your next topic that you guys wanted to share with us. And that's Oregon's recent law that supports the adaptive reuse of old commercial buildings into residential. By the way, I was watching CNBC literally an hour ago while I was getting ready in my bedroom, and New York was talking about this. It was a topic there on the station where they were saying that there were 80 million square feet of vacant office space in New York City, Manhattan, I guess is maybe specifically. And they have changed some zoning laws that have allowed them to turn into to residential. But there was a developer that they were interviewing who's saying, look, that's not quite enough. We need some tax incentives. There's more to it. It's very costly to change this. So this is hot off the press. I mean, this is a very relevant topic on a national level right now. So tell us about Oregon's law and what's going on with that.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this is top of a lot of people's tongues. We have this weird confluence again, where you have an incredible housing need in so many of our key cities, including most of our jurisdictions here in Oregon. And at the same time, with work from home becoming ever more prevalent, you have more and more underutilized commercial office space. And so people are starting to look at that and say, hey, can we marry those two issues together and find a solution? Los Angeles has actually been at the forefront of doing some incredible work here. They started allowing what we call adaptive reuse. That's the conversion of commercial into residential uses back in the late 90s in their downtown core. And that helped spur the creation of 12,000 units of housing. And if anybody's been to downtown Los Angeles in the past 10 years, you'll see that it's vibrant, that it has incredible commercial, a ton of people there, great opportunities to live, work, and play. And that whole community was spurred by the opportunity to do adaptive reuse. So a lot of other cities, including New York and including Portland, are starting to look at that and say, hey, is this something that we can do here and can be an asset to us? So as you talked about, there's really two pieces to the pie here that jurisdictions need to think about if this is something they want to encourage. The first is kind of the regulatory hurdle, right? So if I'm a city, I can make it really friggin' hard, or I can make it really easy for a property owner to say, hey, I'm going to convert my commercial use into residential. And a big part of that is kind of the regulatory framework associated with the types of approvals you need to get to move forward with a project. What the state of Oregon recently did was pass some legislation that cut a lot of that red tape. They said, hey, cities, you can't require X, Y, and Z if an applicant wants to come forward and convert their existing commercial space into residential. And that's really important because what it signals is, hey, if I'm a property owner, now I know that there's a clear path forward for doing what I want to do, and that the jurisdiction isn't going to be able to stop me just because they may find the project not politically palatable. The other piece is what you were hearing about on CNBC, which is, financing these things is particularly challenging. Anytime you're bringing a new product to market, the capital class is going to look at it and shrug its shoulders, right? Because we're basically saying we need a whole new housing typology that doesn't exist, and I can't point to comps to, but I want you to fund it. And so that capital is oftentimes very difficult to acquire. At the same time, not the regulatory framework so much, but the building code environment may add tremendous cost to these conversions. The city of Portland's a prime example. We have an earthquake retrofit ordinance in place that requires you to do significant seismic upgrades depending on the type of building and the type of use of that building. Oftentimes, those upgrades are triggered when you seek to change something within your building footprint. And so those requirements come into play when you want to do an adaptive reuse. And they can be very expensive. So you could be adding tens of thousands of dollars to the cost of one door just to upgrade the building and make it structurally sound. So those are the two pieces that make the capital really important and something that we need to work on. But at the same time, we need to be doing exactly what the state is pushing for, which is liberalizing the regulatory framework such that you can even start thinking about getting these sorts of projects approved.
Gotcha. Are you aware of any such projects underway currently?
So in speaking with the department, the Building and Safety Bureau here in the city of Portland, we're aware of at least two projects that are currently considering going through this process. Obviously, we can't share details about who they are, but sure. It's definitely this idea is percolating through the development community. It's starting to percolate through property owners, and people are thinking about, hey, could this be right for my building?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say to Ezra as well, and the same sort of discussion is also happening up in Washington State and Seattle. Happened to meet with Governor Inslee's housing policy person, and this is a big topic of discussion: is how to do this adaptive reuse of commercial space, as well as I think allow residential by right in certain commercial zones, because quite frankly the nature of commercial is changing now with the movement towards online shopping. It's really become a function of people using commercial services for personal services or restaurants or stuff like that, and not so much for retail unless you're going to like a Target or something. And so there's potentially a dearth of commercial land that could be repurposed over to housing and sort of create a different environment for the cities in the Northwest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see how this shakes out, because I'll be honest, I think Portland has an added challenge that even New York City doesn't have. On CNBC, they were saying rents are at all-time highs in Manhattan, and there is a shortage and a need for housing in their inner downtown core. I've listed some downtown condos. They're not flying right now. Let's just be clear there. So adding more housing stock in the downtown core, I could see where that's going to be risky for developers or people that are funding that development at this juncture anyway of things. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this works out. I hope it does, and I see why on paper it makes a lot of sense, but it'll be, the devil's in the details usually in all these things, right?
Well, we do need the housing. I mean, we still have a housing shortage as of today, with one change, and that is, if COVID taught us anything, it taught us that we don't need to physically be somewhere to talk on our own cell phone and to work on our own computer. Let's cut the commute out and the parking and getting up to your office and doing that all in reverse to get home. There's 90 minutes of your day that you could spend being more productive. And the rents here are nothing like Manhattan, but they ain't cheap. And so if you look at these businesses that are stroking checks for $30,000 and $50,000 for their space in the building, I mean, that takes a extreme bite in your profit because of all that overhead. And if you could outfit people to be just as productive at home with high-speed internet and fast computers, good cameras, all that stuff, I think people are using a little more scrutiny of what's an actual face-to-face thing and what's a Zoom call versus what's a phone call. And I can see the retrofitting be a massive cost and ADA compliance and earthquake approved and all that. I see that being the thing that will hold that up considerably. And Willamette Week just had an article about the Portland building landscape and how we have all this vacancy and these buildings are just sitting there, like Montgomery Park, for example. They're just sitting there with no use. And what can we do to make those buildings more productive today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a client that is looking at doing a demonstration project in the city of Tacoma, and he's a former executive at Microsoft. Really sort of just a really interesting guy. But his take on sort of looking at the economics of it, to kind of go to Ezra's point, is, the Class A office buildings, the ones that like we're in here in Pac West, these aren't going to convert because, quite honestly, the best, highest uses for, is for office. And it's probably not likely that the Class C office space either, because that's where you kind of get business startups and lower stuff. It's really those Class B buildings that are sort of like, they're not A, they're not C, in between, that really have the best opportunity to do something different. But, in addition to having the regulations change to allow the residential use there probably need to be a lot of incentives initially to make sure that those projects can become real, and so they can demonstrate to the Wall Street funders that that's a provable model. I think for some place like the city of Portland that's got a lot of vacancy, or city of Seattle that's got a lot of vacancy, or city of San Francisco that's got even more vacancy than those two cities, they are really got to look at changing how they function as a city and trying to get residents back into the city and becoming a population center rather than an office center. Is that shift has got to happen based on this new sort of virtual working environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next topic. City of Portland decision to greatly increase the opportunity to build senior housing in residential zones. What's that about?
Yeah. So I think as we're becoming hyper-focused on getting more housing into just all venues or areas in the state. One of the things that the city of Portland's looking at has been expanding the ability to put senior housing in residential, in like common single-family residential zoning districts. In fact, we have one project that we're working on right now that's on appeal to Portland City Council that does exactly that. And so it would be sort of in a traditional low density single family area, but we're able to put in a significant amount of units there because of the flexibility that the city of Portland has granted us in the zoning code. And it's a good thing because it's providing an answer to a need there, which is to have affordable housing for our seniors that may be struggling with the price increases that have happened during our decades of explosive growth here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So expound on the opportunity. Explain that a little further, Jamie. I mean, what did they change?
They did some tweaks to the code to basically push out the ability to put effectively multiple family senior housing projects within certain zoning districts within the city of Portland, whereas before those were, very much precluded and you had to go to like a commercial zone in order to locate those. But now they're being allowed to be placed in residential zoning districts. And so providing more opportunity for the development community to look at placing those in sort of traditional single family neighborhoods.
Gotcha. Do you find that most of these, and I've actually, believe it or not, I've listed and sold one of these in Gresham. It was a client that reached out to me. It looked kind of like a massive house, and it was, there was an area of the house that was their residence, and then there was a whole wing that was adult care, right? And there was probably 7 or 8 rooms and, all the common area and everything. And we listed and sold it. This was a few years back. Do you find that most of these are built new, or are they remodeled structures that are converted into this?
I think what you're looking at is going to be mostly new construction because of the other regulatory things you need to do for, the care aspect of
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to see is probably a proliferation of these new builds that have this senior living component to it. And I think that a lot of the senior housing builders are kind of being smart about it, realizing that there may be compatibility issues with where they're promoting to place this. And so they're trying to design the buildings so they aren't just looking commercial in nature and just flat face. For instance, there's articulation and to make it fit in a little bit better to the neighborhoods.
Not that different than the middle housing stuff going on, right? Where they're building duplexes and triplexes in single family zoning areas, but they're trying to make them look to fit in, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Interesting. So in the past, it was very problematic and challenging to find residential areas to do this. You kind of had to go more towards commercial spaces, but Portland is making this easier to do.
That's correct.
Okay. Interesting.
Well, I think it's part of years ago, they had the RIP movement, Residential Infill Project. And I think it started in Multnomah County. And we got information on it like a year to 18 months beforehand. But it was the thing that said, if your house is on a corner, you could have a duplex or a triplex, or keep the existing house and have an ADU. And there were all these rules, like they were saying, look, we need houses for people, not for cars. So they were discouraging cars and garages, and they were discouraging the tall, skinny, where the stairs go up to the door. And if you have a garage, the garage can't take up more than 50% of the width. And now that that's kind of in place, I have people call all the time and they're like, hey, can I put an ADU here? And it's gotten so complicated that I just say, I don't know. And then you can go spend a month at the county and ask all the questions. And a month later, you're still, I really don't know. How is that residential infill project going with, I think they implemented it in Multnomah County, and I think it's carrying over to Clackamas County, where it's more likely they could build an ADU than not these days.
Yeah, these are great questions, Joe. And you're absolutely right. There's really a statewide effort to rethink about traditional single family zones and allow for property owners to have greater freedom when it comes to building different housing typologies. As you talked about, how do we build better homes for people rather than just focus on hyper-prescriptive rules? So the city of Portland implemented what they called the Residential Infill Project. You mentioned that, Steve. And that, based on that project, which has been in place for a little over a year, the city just issued a report to talk about the implications associated with the changes. And the report, I think, is promising, but needs to be tempered. And it basically says, hey, we've been able to approve several hundred units of housing. These are housing typologies, either duplexes or triplexes, that in the rare case, up to 4 units that otherwise wouldn't have been permitted in this zone. And so we see this kind of incremental addition of density generally. And that's fantastic. But several hundred units a year in the city of Portland isn't going to close, the 60,000 unit gap that this region has. So it's a useful tool, but in and of itself, it doesn't get us where we need to be. Now, the state, kind of in conjunction with, but also kind of going on their own path, crafted a set of rules generally that every single jurisdiction, whether you're a city or a county, need to implement. Those rules generally promote accessory dwelling units, attached homes, and the like. And jurisdictions are going through the process of updating their rules to implement these new state requirements. So when you talk about Clackamas County now permitting some, we're seeing the same thing with the cities in Washington County. We're seeing the same things going down south. And interestingly enough, there's been a similar push in Washington state. So we see new rules in Clark County around permitting smaller houses and the like. I think this is a theme that we're going to continue to see as the housing need exists. The state is going to need to think creatively about how to allow people to build homes so they can actually find the housing that they need.
The one thing I'd say too with that is Minneapolis-St. Paul was even ahead of Oregon on this, and they sort of did away with single family zoning a couple of years ago. And I think their yield out of 4 years of doing that was only about 66 units, which there was something really paltry. And so to Ezra's point, like, I think we need to throw, every solution we can to try to get to that 60,000 unit number that we have a deficit here in the region on. And I think middle housing and RIP in Portland is a way to start nibbling at that. But we need to get production going in a much larger volume. And so I think some of these bigger ideas need to come to bear here on the region in order to really crack that 60,000 nut number.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's segue real quick. This wasn't a topic that you guys brought in here, but let's just talk about Multnomah County and the challenges to build there. I have heard builder after builder after builder just throw in the towel, including Renaissance Homes almost entirely, and say, I can't build there anymore. It is such a nightmare to deal with. I mean, you guys have to be on the front lines of these problems. Is that an accurate statement? I mean, and what has to give there?
Yeah, that's a great point. We hear it from clients as well, day in and day out. Building in the city of Portland specifically has been challenging for years, and it's gotten significantly harder. You may have seen some articles in the Willamette Week and the Oregonian recently about a kind of conversation the city is having about how to think about its development bureaus generally. The city of Portland, as they like to trumpet, has a really unique form of government. And this unique form of government has led to what we see as a really aggressive silo effect, where different bureaus, they call them bureaus in the city instead of departments, may not even talk to each other or may have such a standoffish relationship that getting coordination between them can be exceedingly challenging. Now, where this comes into play with development is because if I want to build a new house or a multifamily project in the city of Portland, I'm going to need support from multiple development bureaus to sign off on my plans and to coordinate their comments in such a way that I can revise my plans and get them approved. But when the bureaus themselves are at loggerheads and not agreeing on what should or shouldn't be located in a particular place, this can cause significant delay and significant costs. I'll share an anecdote only so people get a sense of what we're talking about. One bureau is going to tell you what to put in your frontage. They're going to say, hey, your driveway can be this wide. I want a planter strip here. I want a tree here. I want some shrubs, etc. Another bureau is going to tell you, hey, I need X number of trees per linear foot of frontage. And then a third bureau is going to come in and tell you, hey, I need your utility connection point to be in a particular place. Now, if I'm dealing with a small lot, this can oftentimes lead to being told to put utility infrastructure and a tree and a driveway in the exact same location, which, Joe, you're smiling. You can't do it. Now, in pretty much every other major city in America, all of these requirements would have been reviewed together and integrated into a single document or set of documents that would guide what should go on my frontage. But in Portland, they're managed by different bureaus who, as I mentioned, don't necessarily agree with each other all of the time. So we get situations where builders will come to us and say, hey, I've been told to do 3 different things in this one particular place. I don't know how to address this issue. And absent better communication between the bureaus, it's very challenging to move those projects forward. Now, there has been some great conversation recently, particularly spurred by Commissioner Carmen Rubio, who's looked at this problem and said, guys, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we the only major city in America who does things this way? We need to consolidate the bureaus, or those portions of the bureaus that relate to the development generally, but specifically with regards to housing, so that we can start making sure that our plans talk to each other, that our planners talk to each other, and that we're all on the same page with what our requirements are. And, we've heard from many in the development community that this is a fantastic idea. Kind of gone are the days where Portland should be hyper-focused on being unique. We should really just be focused on doing things the right way so that people like Renaissance Homes and others aren't leaving the city and saying, I don't want to build here anymore.
Kelly Wendell commented and she said 2197. I don't know what that means. Do either of you know what that is? That a bill?
That's the year Multnomah County figures it out. I think that's optimistic, Kelly. My clients don't have a problem with Multnomah County when I talk to them and they say, hey, Joe, we want to find a house. They just simply say, not Multnomah County. So we don't put any time there. We don't burn any brain tissue. They go into it as to why, and they don't have to, but they talk about tax structure and homeless and the RIP project that is kind of turning it into, actually, it might be providing a little bit more residential living, but it's also a parking nightmare, the way they structure it, that they don't like off-street parking. There's something else, and I don't know if you guys touch on this or not, but kind of in the front of a lot of communities, there's people pro and people against STRs, short-term rentals. So, you have a place, whether it's at the coast, whether it's at Sun River, whether it's up at the mountain, you have these STRs. And while you have primary residences there as well, these people are making like 3x in rent on a short-term rental as they would if they rented it to a family for, a year, a 1-year lease, because they get the money for the weekend, they get cleaning fees and all the other stuff. And the argument is you have the people that live there full time, and you can guarantee that every Friday and Saturday night, someone's going to have a 10-foot fire. They're going to drink some cold beverages and howl at the moon. They're going to leave garbage around, or if you're at the mountain, they put it in a non-bear rated garbage can, so the bears get into it and throw it all around. Parking problems. And I know that some of these communities are moving towards a no STR, like a 30-day minimum. And some people, it's like a 6-month minimum. How do you think these STRs are affecting the landscape of the greater Portland metro and extended areas?
It's a great question. It's interesting you should bring that up. There's actually was a couple of court cases out of Washington State that just came down around this STR issue, sort of revisiting a recent decision. And I know this is sort of out of the region, but it was up in Chelan County. But it was pretty interesting. It wasn't the local governments trying to restrict them, but it was the neighborhood associations themselves trying to amend their covenants to prevent, the midnight parties that you were talking about, because they would be hearing their STR tenants hoot and holler at, 2 a.m. on every weekend up there. And, it's this sort of this weird intersection between, real property law and land use law that we're sort of seeing a reaction to it. So I think a lot of neighborhoods in of themselves would, like to get rid of the tenants, and, they're looking at potentially amending their CCRs to do that, but that becomes legally a little bit problematic. And so now, they're starting to result to going to local governments to have the local governments pass these ordinances to try to restrict these STRs there. And I think, in some jurisdictions, they're having mixed success with them in doing that. I think from a housing policy standpoint, though, it does make a lot of sense to me that we are trying to preserve the existing housing stock for the residences of those communities rather than just utilize them for tourism. But the free market person in me also says, well,
right. It does kill housing, like long-term housing for people under the guise of making a profit, because they're buying all these investment properties and only renting them really, really short term, which I see lots of problems. I see there's even a bigger housing problem because these are potential homes that could be up for rent for a 6-month or year lease. It kind of kills hotels and some of those other places, but it's also good for restaurants and, bicycle rentals and ski rentals and all that other stuff. I went to a board meeting up at the mountain and they were sort of talking about wanting to limit these STRs. And after leaving the meeting, I just kind of shook my head and I said, this is never, ever going to happen, because it was just a few passionate people who didn't like it. And you have this huge confluence of everyone who owns a rental there that's making 3x of what they could rent, or they can go work on it for a week and write the whole thing off and enjoy a 1-week vacation. I think they're starting to implement that in certain areas, like in the coast, where you can't do it so much. But, okay, so the different segue, and I know we're talking about land use, but it's also sort of building codes and retrofitting. The city of Milwaukee banned new construction that has Northwest natural gas.
Was it Milwaukee or Eugene?
I thought it was
Did Milwaukee do it too? Because I know Eugene tried and then it got reversed, I heard. Yeah, that is an interesting conversation. I'm curious your guys' take on that.
Yeah. What do you think about that? Especially with more people having electric cars, California having brownouts and blackouts. I'm really curious of the reason why they did it, but what are your views on the city mandating what you can and can't use for power?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that a lot of communities across this country are having. The regulations you mentioned from Eugene were modeled after some regulations in Berkeley and Milwaukee, and a number of cities throughout the region are having these conversations. I think, Joe, to your first question is why a lot of people who are concerned about carbon emissions look to natural gas and say, I see less of a carbon footprint with electricity when it's renewably generated. Therefore, we should be using electricity. But as you noted, right, there's really no free lunches in this business. And so, we're in a state that has tremendous heat in the summer, but we also get tremendous cold in the winter. And I'm sure a number of your listeners remember the horrific impacts of the snowstorm of several years ago in the communities of Westland, Lake Oswego, and Portland, when a number of power lines went down and folks were hard pressed to find heating. So it can be particularly challenging. And I think this is an issue that's going to be with us for years to come as conversations around climate change continue to persist.
Yeah, I think in Washington State in particular, I think they're even looking at more aggressive, potentially statewide limitations on new gas appliances. And I think it's just probably a topic that we'll be talking a lot more about in housing here in the next decade to come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of momentum against natural gas for sure. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, which is unfortunate in some ways, because I remember it wasn't that long ago, just a few years ago. I mean, that was a requirement of a lot of home buyers. They had to have that. There are some cooktops that are coming out that, and I forget the name of it. Help me out, Joe, if you remember it, but that's instant heat without the natural gas. It's
induction or something.
What is it?
Induction.
Yeah. So there are some things coming along that hopefully could help in the event that it is eventually does go in that direction. But it is a big change, and it's kind of happening under our feet, it feels like. Now, what was the reason for the reversal in Eugene? Was there a federal court that reversed that? Do you guys know the details there?
Yeah, I believe it was a federal court saying that the city didn't have the authority to regulate that wasn't within their purview to do so. And I think, philosophically speaking, I'm not opposed to the Northwest and California being the leaders in, the world for that matter on climate change issues. I think it's extremely important. And maybe this isn't going to be a future topic for us, but I've got a lot of concerns that the Northwest in general is not planning enough for potential migration into our area from places that are just getting, warmer, for instance. And so, we're struggling to meet our population needs now. What happens if that gets exacerbated in the future? But long way of saying it is I'm not sure that doing, bans on a city by city basis is necessarily the best way to go about affecting the policy in this area. I think it needs to, happen at a state and maybe larger level, figure out what objectives we're trying to achieve. And, houses, modern houses, as Ezra knows, as, representing a couple of home building companies for coming back to laws, they're built really, energy efficient wise, and building codes require that. And so it's oftentimes the older housing stock or the older building stocks that are the ones that, may need the help. And yet all the new regulations tend to focus on the new construction. And so you're getting infinitesimal returns by continuing to require things. All you're doing is adding cost to the house, which isn't maybe a smart way to do things. I think we may have to fundamentally shift and think about how to go back and retrofit existing stuff as a better means to sort of achieve these climate policies.
Such a good point. Yeah. Because here it's a conundrum where you're trying to affect change on a climate level with new housing, which is such a microcosm of what's actually the housing stock. Yet it's also impeding that new housing stock through cost, which then causes a ripple effect of another problem. So, yeah.
It makes you wonder, why would they mandate in Milwaukee, electric only, heat pumps and such? Why wouldn't they also mandate that a certain percentage of the roof line had to be solar? I mean, they're dictating the power that you draw from, but they're not proposing a solution of where that extra power comes from. It's just, if they have the authority to dictate that, then they might as well bundle it and say, hey, only electric, and you're going to need to generate your own electricity, or at least that portion. I don't think all of these rules and regulations are very well thought out. And that's my biggest frustration with the cities and counties kind of telling us what to do. Some I agree with, a lot of them I don't.
Well, you have to think about it from the regulator's standpoint. And I know this is a discussion we often have. It's easier to attack the new construction where there isn't a resident living in it yet versus going and making requirements on, existing neighborhoods where you have people that are, living there and, sort of bought into it. And so this is, I think, why they always sort of chase the new construction versus looking at things to do the retrofit. But I think there has to be this fundamental shift in the way we're going about doing this, because we're getting diminishing returns on doing things on the new construction versus going in and maybe doing the retrofitting the existing stock.
Yeah, good point. Hey, Joe, just for clarification, are you talking about Milwaukee, Wisconsin?
No, Milwaukee here.
Okay. Maybe
it was I read a headline, so don't always believe headlines, and but I thought it was Milwaukee here.
Yeah. Well, they are spelled differently, just so you know.
Okay.
I hadn't heard that one. We'll have to research that.
Yeah.
There was another topic you guys had brought for us, a review of the current state of affairs for buildable land in the Portland region. And you also said and more. So I'll let you guys run with that and then the more.
Well, we're always and more. I think, we talked a little bit about our housing deficit here. If you look at the Portland region, I think most recent numbers say we're missing about 60,000 units of housing, probably about 100,000 if you expand beyond that down towards the Salem area and in the southern part of the state. And the way that we come up with those numbers is essentially looking at population growth in the form of household formation. And you, on the other hand, you look at the number of housing units built, right? And so this many people moved in, do we build this much housing for them? And, we're roughly building about 7 homes of all types for every 10 families that come to the Portland region, right? And so just doing the math right there, there's an existing deficit, and that deficit has existed and grown actually since the Great Recession. So that's how we get to our 60,000 number in the Portland region. So cities, in recognizing this, I think are starting to really, really think about their long-term growth. And we have a couple of great leaders in the region. Beaverton and Hillsborough have done fantastic work on the west side, as is Tigard. The city of Tigard recently just got approval for a large expansion of their existing community that's going to bring, I believe, thousands of housing units over the next couple of decades, which will be fantastic. King City, similarly, essentially doubling in size and building some fantastic amenities for future residents there. But, one of the oddities of our system is that we require a ton of inputs into the hopper before we can even allow 1 acre of land to convert from farmland to non-farm uses. This is fairly unique to Oregon. There are similar systems in place in Washington, California, and other places, but by and large, we require a ton of inputs. A lot of information needs to go in to justify, again, that 1 acre converted to non-farmland use. And oftentimes, the information that jurisdictions put in that hopper may be out of date or may not be reflective of the true situation as it exists today. A great example is the city of Hillsborough, who's currently going through its long-term planning process to determine how much housing it's going to need in the next 20 years. And they received a number from Metro, the regional government, that says, they're going to grow a certain amount. But that amount is really very low. And so the city of Hillsborough, in conjunction with some folks in the building community, really scrutinize those numbers and are looking at them intently and saying, do we want to grow the bare minimum, or do we want to prepare, as Jamie mentioned, for the influx of people that are going to continue to come to our region in the next couple of decades? Because as cities know, if you don't allow for the housing to come, then it's very difficult for the major employers to relocate or expand because their employees can't find enough housing. And so, to its credit, the city of Hillsborough, again, in conjunction with the local development community, is scrutinizing these inputs that I mentioned such that they can really true them up and make sure that the numbers are sound, such that the basis for growth is reflective of our actual needs. That's a super, super long-winded way of essentially saying, we believe, and the development community believes writ large, that the growth that we have seen here over the past several decades will continue and increase, not, as some of the academic bigwigs say, will decrease based on data that may have existed on a 1-year time frame during the pandemic. So one thing for your members to think about with regards to the long-term health of the region is, are cities acknowledging the fact that growth is going to continue here over the next years? And if so, are they acknowledging that fact by putting the appropriate inputs into their analysis when they look at future growth? So it's a dry subject, I know, but I think the takeaway here is that cities are starting to really scrutinize how they come up with knowing how much they should grow, and that scrutiny is at least in the circumstances that we're seeing it, a real benefit to the home selling community writ large.
And then on the Washington side, the other side of the Columbia, Clark County is embarking on their urban growth boundary or urban growth area update that Washington State requires as part of their Growth Management Act. And this process just sort of kicked off this year. It's set to conclude in June of 2025. Washington's system came along a little bit later than Oregon's system. And so they kind of adopted a little bit of a different system. And it's a little bit more local control and local decision-making and sort of these policies in terms of how they're growing in relation to the math that Ezra was describing with the buildable lands report. So right now, there's a lot of folks in the home building and real estate industry, and also from the economic development side of things, that have been giving real-time feedback to the decision makers as to what they're seeing on the ground in terms of consumption of real estate, as well as how the new regulations around environment and climate and stuff are impacting their ability to, fully utilize the property. And, they're trying to reconcile that to come up with what the actual need will be there to accommodate Clark County's population, which will carry into, 2043. And so while Oregon is doing this analysis, Clark County is just embarking on their end. And so I think that there'll be a lot of opportunity for those of us in sort of the real estate development community to give appropriate input to those jurisdictions and hopefully try to guide them towards policies that will help us accommodate both the need for housing and jobs in the future.
Interesting. Very interesting. We do have a question from one of our listeners, Dan Hardy. Didn't it take 25 years for McMinnville to get any urban growth expansion? Do either of you know anything about that?
Yes. Long time.
Short answer, yes. Longer answer, yeah. It takes decades for cities to bring land in. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the early conversations around projected growth are accurate, because at the end of the day, once that land comes in, the population's already going to be here, and you need adequate supply in order to meet their demand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's funny. I've had clients that have speculatively bought property on the line of the UGB, just thinking, hey, this thing's going to convert, and now I'm going to sell it for 10x when this can be divided. Well, fast forward 25 years, it's still the same zoning. So it's pretty interesting that people used to do that in the past, thinking, I'm buying this, they're going to convert it to high density, I'm going to make a killing, and then I retire. And
well, I know I'll probably get a bunch of hate email for this, but Stafford is the classic example, right? Here you're thinking this area of land is right on 205. It has got freeway access. There's opportunities for employment, all throughout the region. And yet that land has been sort of held as this sacrosanct sacred cow that hasn't allowed expansion in it. Whereas, Metro in the past chose places like Damascus or the former city of Damascus, and
which was a mess. Wasn't it a mess?
Which was a complete mess. And there's sort of this recognition, okay, it's not high value farmland, but from a development standpoint, you've got vertical curves, which create problems for, pumping sewer out of stuff, getting water there. It's a transportation cost too much money. And so, I think that, again, there needs to be rethinking. Not only is it appropriate for, farm use there, but there also needs to be this real world calculation as how expensive is it to serve these properties, and not pick areas for expansion that are so expensive to develop that you're never gonna utilize that. So otherwise, why have the land there? Just to say you can meet a population that it will never practically happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how long's the infrastructure for schools and stores and commerce? And, you can build your house there, but you might have to wait 10 years before everything kind of fills in.
Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of the area over in Beaverton, where near Mountainside High School. Lots of housing going up, but you're not seeing the commercial infrastructure follow suit yet. And that could change, but it's interesting. I guess that brings up another question. You guys are in the front lines of this. Do you guys have any guesses as to where the next annexations or developments will be? Obviously, South Hillsborough has been big for a few years, and then that area off Roy Rogers and Shoals has been big. Is there something that should be on our radar that could be another big area for expansion?
Well, I think under the new system, the cities really have to raise their hand and say, we want to do the planning exercise here to justify those expansions. And you get these land exchanges or land swaps, which allow certain jurisdictions to grow. And I think that that's what we're seeing in some of these areas in Washington County, like Sherwood and King City and Hillsborough and others. I suspect that the growth pressure is still going to sort of be in that westerly direction. I know that a lot of our clients have, pushed beyond the Tri-County region here and are doing stuff in Yamhill County, certainly Newburgh, McMinnville, Lafayette, as well as like these places I used to think were the moon. I mean, no offense to Estacada, but Estacada, there's a lot of development going there. And I think Cascade Locks, that's a reflection of how expensive things are here in the Tri-County, the immediate core, I guess, area that people are having to push out further and further away to find affordable housing.
I think it's also a testament to the fact the world's changed a little bit, and there is a little bit of a migration away from urban areas. Growing up, I grew up in a small town outside of Salem, and everybody wanted to go to the big city, go to Portland, right? That was, and now I feel a little bit as a busy real estate agent. I'm seeing a lot of people going, hey, I'm selling my house and moving to Dundee or McMinnville and I think part of that is just, some of the after effects of, the homeless crisis, taxation in the Tri-County area, all the little, ancillary taxes they're throwing on everything. And just it's an interesting trend that's occurring. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in housing and development as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, the metro region certainly will still be attractive to out-of-state buyers because, people particularly coming from California or maybe the Seattle area, this is still a relative bargain, maybe where they can't afford to purchase houses where they're residing currently.
Hey, well, you guys have been fantastic. Ezra, do you have anything more in the more category, or are you guys all good?
Yeah, I think we touched on a ton of great stuff. It's a real treat joining you, Joe and Steve. Thank you for having us. And, it's a crazy world out here. It's going to continue to be crazy. As realtors, I think it's super valuable for you to stay on top of things that happen in the land use world. Because as you said, that's the land that's going to get brought in 2 decades from now. Those are the homes that are going to be built 3 years from now. And at the end of the day, those are the units that are going to keep realtors employed and selling homes throughout the region.
Absolutely. And I would also say, Ezra, anytime you guys have a new subject or topic or something that's happening, please reach out to me and we'd love to get you guys back on the show and do this again for sure. So, well, any final thoughts, Joe, before we cut it all loose?
Nope. It was good. We learned some stuff, and I'm convicted that I am not a new construction guy. All of this stuff is important for my work, but I don't think I have the bandwidth. I don't think my marriage could survive building new construction. And what was spurred in COVID was everyone ran out and bought a Sprinter van. I think that's still going on. People like people, but they don't mind driving a half an hour to be with them. And then they want to drive a half hour and get away from them. And I think the hot spots are the outskirts of the Tri-County area. And I think that's where a lot of people are trying to uproot and go out that way, far Clackamas County or further west beyond, Hillsborough, Forest Grove, North Plains. I think that's the trend. So anyway, thanks for being on the show, both of you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Steve, how about you? Anything? Parting words?
All good. All good.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your contributions, those of you that chimed in on the Facebook group, and we'll be getting this out as a podcast here in the next couple of days.
All right.